It's a real pleasure to be here this morning. I want to start by thanking Jerzy Hausner for the opportunity to speak before you and be part of the Open Eyes Economy Summit here in Krakow. I'm always looking for an excuse to come to Krakow. And it's also a real honor to follow someone as esteemed as Adam Rotfeld, the former foreign minister of Poland. It kind of really actually makes me a little bit nervous. I've been asked to talk about geopolitical challenges before the West. When you have a conference like this, on a subject like this, one can think of many cliches. We're in a world of accelerating and volatile change, constant conference theme. We're at an inflection point. This is something that my home institution at the Atlantic Council was always saying. And then my favorite one, because of what's going on in Washington, is we are amidst a great transition. And indeed, in Washington, we are amidst a transition. Now, all these cliches have a certain degree of truth to them. They remind us that it's useful to take stock of the world, to see what are the major dynamics, what are the major muscle movements in the world before us. And what I'd like to do today is share with you some of my perceptions of 5 muscle movements underway that will largely shape the transatlantic agenda in the near, medium, and long term. The first is the grand shift in power we're now experiencing from the West to the rest of the world. You're probably all familiar with Fareed Zakaria's phrase, rise of the rest, a phrase that refers to the diffusion of prosperity and technology from the Euro-Atlantic region to the rest of the world. And we're all aware of the rise of new economic powers with increasingly global reach. China, India, Brazil, and others. And with that economic power often comes a propensity to acquire greater military power. And complementing the rise of these other powers has been the diffusion of technology, particularly military technology, around the world. Not just to great powers, but to middle powers and even non-state actors. Think of the diffusion of cyber capabilities, missiles, even weapons of mass destruction. We see nuclear tests and missile tests in North Korea. We're seeing non-state actors firing sophisticated ballistic missiles in Syria, in Yemen. U.S. ships were recently attacked by ballistic missiles fired by Yemeni non-state actors. This is a real diffusion of military capability, and it makes it more difficult and more costly to conduct military operations around the world. Take information warfare. This is a realm that the West used to be predominant in. We were the best at it during the Cold War. Yet today, the transatlantic community is being outmaneuvered by Russian armies of internet trolls and even the communication cells of non-state actors like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. This shift in power from the West to the rest is profound, and it has urgent implications. It's creating new, complex constellations of power around the world, countries that have regional and often global reach and ambitions. It shouldn't be surprising that in a world of new and renewed global powers, regional powers, you have the emergence or re-emergence of new and renewed territorial claims, historic grudges, territorial demands, economic demands. And these all yield greater geopolitical tension, competition, and sometimes collision. We're in a world where regional conflicts are more likely, where consensual decision-making in organizations like NATO and the UN is more difficult. We're in a world that's more volatile and unpredictable. Amidst this volatility is the second major dynamic, and that's Russia's emergence as a convulsive force in international affairs. Putin's goals are clear, at least in my mind. He wants to reanimate Moscow's control over the space of the former Soviet Union and perhaps beyond. Second, he wants to weaken the West, and particularly U.S. leadership. And third, he wants to make sure that Russia is a global actor of significance. And he's pursuing these objectives with vigor. I mean, his is a set of 20th century objectives being executed through 21st century techniques and old-fashioned brute force. You know the campaign history. Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, frozen conflicts. You know the tools: economic embargoes, information warfare, energy cutoffs, frozen conflicts, subterfuge, even terrorism and information warfare. This all rests on a significant modernization of the Russian military. Putin has dedicated some $750 billion to be spent over this decade to modernize the Russian military, to give it fifth-generation aircraft, to expand the fleet of its naval fleets, to bring in fifth-generation air and missile defense systems, to modernize his precision strike capabilities with Iskanders and Caliber missiles, to increase the capabilities and numbers of special forces. And these investments are having effect. Compare the sloppiness of the 2008 Georgia invasion to the professionalism of the invasion of Crimea. In the invasion of Crimea, we saw special forces that were well-equipped, highly disciplined. They're clearly a bigger bully on the block, and it should be a real concern. The implications of Russia's aggression are serious. It's a real threat to the security order that has kept peace and delivered prosperity in the Euro-Atlantic area. If we're not careful, we're going to allow Putin to create a new confrontational divide in Europe, a divide between a region defined by self-determination, rule of law, and democracy, and another region characterized by autocracy, hegemony, if not occupation. And there's a very dangerous escalatory dynamic at play here, too. If you look over the last 2 years, Russian military provocations have steadily escalated in their brazenness, from what I would describe as a cautious invasion of Crimea to dangerous nuclear rhetoric and threats backed by nuclear exercises, territorial incursions into the waters of Sweden and the UK and otherwise, harassment of U.S. ships, Polish helicopters, to even the attack on U.S. freedom fighters, U.S.-backed freedom fighters in Syria, a provocation we haven't seen since the Vietnam War, and now intervention in our own elections. This is a steady escalation of brazenness. I'm not saying it's preparations for war, but it certainly increases the risk of miscalculation and unintended collision with dangerous escalatory dynamics. The challenge before the West is to convince Putin to drop his revanchist agenda and to recognize the benefits of collaboration. Toward that end, the West is going to have to more effectively and with greater determination and resolve leverage its political, economic, and military advantages to ensure that Putin recognizes the costs of aggression and to demonstrate that the West cannot be intimidated by threats of conflict escalation. And of course, at the same time, we have to seek to pursue constructive areas of engagement, if not cooperation, with Moscow. The second major driver of the world order today is China's emergence as a significant but fragile superpower. Its growth has been unbelievable. 10% a year of GDP growth on average since 1978. Its economy has expanded eightfold over the last decade and a half. It's a primary driver of world growth. It's financially present in every continent. This economic growth is facilitating grand ambitions. China's One Belt, One Road project linking Eurasia and Europe promises to be a catalyst of prosperity across the Eurasian landmass. Chinese investment in this part of the world can be very constructive. Properly managed, properly regulated, properly overseen, it could help facilitate infrastructure projects that will link this region's countries together and the region as a whole to a wider Europe. But China's emergence as a global power is not clear it's a positive or destabilizing dynamic. It features a territorial aggressive foreign policy. What China is trying to do in the South China Sea could create precedents as dangerous as Russia's occupation and seizure of Crimea and Donbass. And the magnitude of the Chinese economy is matched by its own systemic fragility. Its economic growth is a risk of stalling, and there's even many economists who are saying that there's a risk of long-term stagnation in China. Both scenarios pose risks for the West. An economic stall by China would be damaging to the West's anemic, sustained, anemic, and easily reversible growth today. Stagnation in the Chinese economy would be a real burden, a drag on the global economy. And economic malaise in China is a recipe for internal stability. And internal stability is a recipe for further riskier foreign adventurism. The challenge before the West is more complex than that posed by Russia. The challenge now, in the case of China, is to deter aggression while at the same time ensuring that China avoids economic failure. This is not a Pacific concern or solely a Pacific concern, it's a transatlantic concern. We need greater collaboration between Europe and the United States on China. I'm surprised it's not happening. Look how much collaboration there is on Russia. Now, I understand the geographic proximity of Russia and the military dimensions of the collision between the East and the West. But China is 12 times the size of the Russian economy. The United States and Europe have a common interest in ensuring that China's rise reinforces rather than undermines the rules and institutions that brought prosperity and peace across the world. The fourth challenge in the world order is the massive upheaval we're seeing in the developing world, particularly Middle East and North Africa. This is where we're seeing a violent juxtaposition of the good and the bad of globalization. I think this part of the region of the world is being driven most by the communication revolution. That's so much part of globalization. Social media, internet, cable TVs are driving a global political awakening, to use my father, Zbigniew Brzezinski's phrase. That's empowering citizens. And that can be a double-edged sword. It can bring down dictatorships and forward democracy, but it can be an impatient force, one easily corrupted by those with extremist agendas. The dynamics we see in Syria and in Libya aren't inevitable elsewhere in the developing world, but we'd be naive to think that the effects of globalization, good and bad, are not going to permeate the rest of that world. Our current focus on this part of the world has been tactical and reactive, focusing primarily on the destroying of terrorists and humanitarian assistance. Again, those are urgent priorities. But the strategic challenge is to eliminate the political and economic conditions upon which ideological extremists scavenge for legitimacy and recruits. And that's going to require political, economic, and military resources. And finally, the fifth dynamic is a dynamic among us, among the transatlantic community. Both sides of the Atlantic are being racked by populist, nativist, xenophobic currents. These attacks on the principles of openness, free trade, collaboration, cooperation, these prescriptions of walls and borders, isolationism, protectionism, pretend to pull the Euro-Atlantic community apart. Make no mistake, these centrifugal dynamics are having impact. They have rendered NATO less capable of responding with determination, resolve, and dispatch to key challenges, including that posed by Russia. The UK Brexit vote weakened the European Union. It's putting at risk key trade agreements that promise to benefit both sides of the Atlantic with greater prosperity and economic resilience. Now, I know many of you are concerned about the US election, so let me make a couple comments on that. This was an inelegant affair in the United States. And in the realm of foreign policy, it featured a lot of one-line policy prescriptions, walls, dropping of trade agreements, deals with Russia. Those are troubling. If there's a silver lining, none of these one-liners have ever been articulated in detail. Their scope hasn't been defined, how they would be operationalized hasn't been expressed. We need to all take a deep breath and let the transition in Washington occur before making premature overreactions. I urge you to watch for key indicators. Who will be the key appointments in the Trump administration? Who will be National Security Advisor? Who will be the Secretary of State? Who will be the Secretary of Defense? Personnel is policy. I think it's especially true in this administration. Other key indicators to watch will be the decision-making process. And regarding Europe, here's what I'm watching for. Will the new administration emphasize allies and partners over adversaries? See who he meets with first, the new team. Second, I'm hoping the new administration, or sometime during the transition, will reaffirm U.S. commitment to the European Reassurance Initiative, the deployment of U.S. forces in Central Europe, including here in Poland, and commitment to NATO's enhanced forward presence, the deployment of battalions to the Baltic states and Poland. Will they reaffirm sanctions on Russia? And will they avoid the language of the deal, which, of course, here in this part of the world brings back memories of Yalta, and I think stimulates some of the worst tendencies in Western Europe and probably raises expectations, and hopefully in Moscow. I was troubled by the EU foreign ministers' meeting last Sunday.